You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast, and I have Philip Deschamps. He's the CEO of Helius Medical. The website is Helius Medical, Helius Medical. And we were talking about portable neurostimulation. So, Phil, thanks for coming.
It's my pleasure, Richard. Nice to be on the phone with you.
Yeah. So, what does portable neurostimulation mean? How would you want to stimulate yourself, and for what purposes?
Well, it's actually called PoNS, so PoNS, which is portable neuromodulation stimulator. That's actually what the device does, but you're absolutely correct in saying that this is ultimately about neuromodulation. So neuromodulation is external stimulation of the brain, and we'll also we'll discuss a term called neuroplasticity, which is actually the ability of your brain to modify itself, to potentially change itself, to improve itself, to heal itself, and those are the two neurosystems that are at play here.
Okay, so is this more for people that have disease or dysfunction, or is it for people that want to improve their ability to think and their functioning capability?
Well, the one we know about so far is it seems to help people relieve neurological symptoms of disease or trauma. So what's been done so far is the PoNS has been developed as a medical device, and essentially we've done clinical trials, and the primary first indication is that we're seeking from FDA, and we're already cleared in Canada for, is called chronic balance deficit from a mild to moderate traumatic brain injury or concussion or sports concussive injuries or anything like that. So that's the first indication, and we hope over time to be cleared for many more things like MS and Parkinson's and stroke and cerebral palsy and things like that. But from here, for the time being, those are completely experimental potential indications.
So what happens when you get a traumatic brain injury, when it affects your balance chronically? Are you literally unable to maintain your balance? I mean, how bad does it get, and what does it look like and feel like?
Sure. So when people have any kind of a neurological issue, so like MS and Parkinson's, the most common symptom is a balance disorder. Now, whether it becomes chronic or not is really dependent, especially on the traumatic brain injury side, is really dependent on your own body and brain chemistry. So here's how the numbers work. If you've had a traumatic brain injury or a concussion or any kind of a bonk to the head, which could include falls, bar fights, any kinds of things like that, you have about a 2/3 chance of recovering, if it's a mild to moderate, of recovering without doing anything, and that typically happens over 3 to 6 months period. But unfortunately, about a third of us who have that injury will actually have chronic symptoms. And unfortunately, when those chronic symptoms set in, they usually set in for life. And of the people who have chronic symptoms, about 40% of them have balance disorder as their primary symptom. So that's how the sort of the cascade of risk goes down for someone who's been traumatically brain injured. So if we want to relate that to real U.S. numbers, there's about 5 million people in the U.S. That have chronic symptoms of a traumatic brain injury. So that's the sort of the macro number, and that results roughly from 15 million blows to the head around in the country. But those who have chronic disorders is about 5 million people, and as I said, 30 to 40% of those have a chronic balance disorder. So that means between 1.5 and 2 million people in the U.S. have this specific diagnosis. We don't hear a lot about it because there's never really been a treatment for it. So it's a little like, erectile dysfunction or ED, and nobody really knew about it until Viagra came out and there was something to treat it. And so we're a little bit in that situation. Certainly everybody's heard about concussions and sports concussive injuries, sort of made famous by the NFL and their the monitoring of all of that.
Right.
But sort of run-of-the-mill kind of traumatic brain injuries or concussions, people have sort of chalked it up to, yeah, I got my bell rung, but that's okay. But unfortunately, many of those actually last a long time. So how people feel when they have a chronic balance deficit is when you can't balance, you struggle to walk. And you, for example, you start to avoid places where there's a lot of people because you know you're going to have to sort of dodge those people. So it causes social isolation, and then it diminishes your capacity to earn because there's not a lot of people can't do the same job that they did before. It doesn't mean that they don't lose their work at all, but many can't continue to do the exact same work, and all the way to full disability. Where you're not able to work or sort of participate in society in the way that we would traditionally do. In fact, many people get prescribed occupational therapy, which basically means how do you learn to live with your disorder.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you. So the therapy is not to improve function, but just how to live with it? I mean, why not try to improve people's function?
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. So the standard of care today without PoNS is to simply do physical therapy. And physical therapy, certainly traumatic brain injuries have been around for millions of years, and physical therapy has been around for probably 100 years. And so the physical therapy community and the literature that sort of understands the relationship between its effectiveness in treating traumatic brain injury or TBI or balance disorder is very, very well known. And typically what happens is, yes, you do improve a little bit, but after you stop doing the exercises, you tend to drift back to your original level of disability. And so that has become so well known that insurance companies and even physicians don't even prescribe the physical therapy because they know it's essentially a Band-Aid for a little while. That then people, sort of drift back in some way for some people, of course.
One quick question. Why would you drift back? I mean, I thought by doing physical therapy, you're training your brain to act in a certain way or to move in a certain way or to, connect this motion to this part of your brain. Why wouldn't that become ingrained with practice, just like practicing basketball or something?
Yeah, it's a very astute question. So you're exactly right. The problem is that the balance center of your body, unlike a muscle or somebody that you're rehabilitating, from a hip injury or a knee injury or an ankle injury, that rehabilitation has to affect your brain. And thus far, it's never been demonstrated that your brain actually changes through physical therapy. So what happens is as you just pointed out, you learn to balance better and you practice to balance better. But when and if you kept up with that practice, you would maintain a certain level of performance. But what the literature would say and clinical experience says is when you stop doing those exercises, you tend to sort of drift back to your original level because there's no change in your brain. And that's what PoNS seems to be able to procure when you combine that physical therapy that we were just talking about to neuromodulation. It seems to put the brain into a plastic state that in fact allows the brain to change itself and follow different pathways and bypass the areas that's been damaged by the disease or the trauma in this case, to make permanent changes to the brain that seems to then sustain over time and essentially restore the balance of people. So that seems to be the difference. And I'm speaking of this, Richard, as if I'm a perfect authority and science knows exactly what I'm talking about. That's the conjecture around this. That's what we see clinically and in the research that we've done. But to tell you that we understand exactly what mechanism this ultimately works in would be a stretch.
Okay, but when you design the device,
yep,
are you first going for a state? Do you want to put a person to a state where they do have neuroplasticity, and then it just so happens that the particular skill you're going to have them work on will benefit them? Because if you figured out how to put the brain into a neuroplastic state, that opens up the door to learn anything or to facilitate learning in anything.
Yeah, that's the ultimate, macro promise of this kind of technology. But in the medical world, you can only make those statements when you actually test them in prospective randomized clinical trials. And so thus far, we've done a clinical trial or two clinical trials in traumatic brain injury where exactly what you said seems to be the outcome. So we've been able to take people in our clinical trials from a pretty profound disability with respect to balance with a prognosis of a lifetime of that disability, and on average make those people go into the normal range of balance over the 14-week program. And so that's what we've tested, and we can categorically say we've also done some work in multiple sclerosis and some work in stroke and some work in cerebral palsy in much smaller studies, but have demonstrated the same thing. So each time we make a statement like that, we have to have the backup in science to be able to prove the statement, and we hope certainly. Yeah, go ahead. We hope certainly that someday that it might help people think better, make human performance better, make athletes better, but we simply don't know that scientifically yet.
Well, what do you know about the activation of neuroplasticity? What are the suggested models for how it happens and what causes it to happen?
So the best evidence that we have today, and it's actually evidence that was generated completely independently of our company, and it was done by two major neuro research centers. And they actually did animal models that pointed at that because they were curious, and this is going to sound like a real stretch, but they were curious as to why some mammals are able to dive to thousands of feet in the ocean and not have a stroke through the pressure. And that's known as the diving reflex. And the diving reflex, both the cold water and the pressure affect a nerve called the trigeminal nerve. And the trigeminal nerve goes from your tongue directly to the back of the brain and has a big imprint on your brain. So the idea that they had was, what if we stimulated electrically that trigeminal nerve and see what happens in a traumatic brain injury model? So that work was done by the Feinstein Institute in Long Island, and it basically showed that when you stimulate the trigeminal nerve, it increases blood flow to the area that was damaged, and so that is potentially one of the mechanisms by which the brain puts itself into a plastic state, and that the area of the brain that's been damaged receives more blood, thus is able to make better connections through the axons and dendrites, and through that find another path to be able to do this. So that is a sort of a layperson's description of what this looks like. But that was also supported by some other work. Yep, sorry, go ahead.
So as a crude hack, could you bite a big ice cube and touch your tongue to it and hold it for a few seconds while learning something, or a minute, and give that effect?
Yeah. What they actually did in the study, the second study, they actually did what you just suggested. They looked at both components of the diving, right? The cold water. As you go deeper, the water gets cold. So they took the same rat and they did this in a stroke model. So they tied off the cerebral artery to rats and gave them a stroke, and then tested both the electrical stimulation of the trigeminal nerve and then the cold stimulation. The cold did have an effect when they essentially put cold compresses on the forehead of the rats. The infarct size was reduced by 31%. And when they did it electrically through the stimulation of the trigeminal nerve directly, the infarct size was reduced by 65%. So that gave everybody a little bit of a scientific inkling that there seems to be something to this trigeminal nerve stimulation. Now, in the rats in these studies, these were done invasively by putting electrodes directly in the brain. Our device actually does that by stimulating the tongue non-invasively and safely. So it's kind of cool to be able to piggyback on that research and able to reproduce those results. We hope in humans based on the same principle.
Okay. So what is the mechanism by which your device induces the neuroplasticity? Is it based on this, or is there another mechanism you found?
No, we think that's Richard. We think that this is at the core of at least part of it. It doesn't explain everything we see, so we're just beginning to figure this out. But what we do is we stimulate the tongue with an electrical pulse, and it essentially sends 25 million pulses to the surface of your tongue over a 20-minute period. And those pulses translate to motor neural impulses, so your tongue feels the electricity, and then it sends a signal to the back of your brain through the trigeminal nerve. And we think that some of the mechanisms that have been elucidated by these scientists is in play. But there certainly are others because there are other manifestations of what we see that can't be explained simply by the trigeminal nerve. And in science and in the healthcare, probably it's 50, 60, 70% of the drugs that are approved for use, we don't really know how they work. We just know that clinically they work, meaning that when you take it, it lowers your cholesterol, and it's safe based on studying a whole bunch of people. But exactly the mechanism of how the cholesterol drugs work to reduce cholesterol is not completely known. And it's the same thing on our side. I think we have a good. We're beginning to have a good idea. And we've tested it clinically, and it does produce these kinds of improvements. But to tell you that we know exactly how it works today, again, would be a stretch.
Have you looked at the work of people that are studying flow states, like Michael Csikszentmihalyi or even Steven Kotler more recently? They talk about people doing like extreme athletics, and it puts them into a flow state where the blood shunts from the frontal lobe to other places, and they're able to perform better than ever. And would that inform what you're doing?
So interesting that you mentioned that. We have a partnership with a clinical trial site in Vancouver, Canada, where they are looking at this from a human performance standpoint, and we're contemplating doing a study in the flow state and to see whether this would be able to accelerate the flow state in athletes. That is work that's going to be contemplated in the 2020 timeframe. But yes, the implications of this in that realm is certainly consistent with what we've seen on the medical side.
So, what are some of the specific metrics by which your system works better than conventional physical therapy for people that have traumatic brain injury? Is there less repetitions needed to lock in a new skill? Is it longer lock-in time? Is it lock-in versus no lock-in? What happens?
Sure. Yeah. So we designed the clinical trial in this way. What we did is we took 163 people in two trials, and there is a scale called the sensory organization test. That is a computerized, completely objective test with a scale of 0 to 100. And if you're 100, you're essentially a balance beam athlete, and you've got perfect balance. And at 1, basically, it's virtually impossible for you to stand. Most humans who don't have a balance deficit will score about 70 on this scale. So as we did our trial, we were saying, look, this is physical therapy is the standard of care. And what happens is after you do a certain amount of physical therapy without neuromodulation, you plateau, and meaning that you don't get better. And so what we did is we took people, and before they were randomized in the trial, we made sure that they did a full course of physical therapy and to be deemed by their clinician to have plateaued, meaning that they're not going to get any better with doing physical therapy alone. And only after that was reached did we randomize them to the trial. So they were, quote, treatment resistant to further physical therapy. And in that population, we saw a 30-point rise on this particular scale, and every 8-point rise on that scale is called clinically and statistically significant. So almost 4 times higher than you would expect that would be noticed by a clinician as clinically significant. So that's the basis for which the Canadian regulators have cleared our technology in Canada, and it's the same data that we sent to FDA, and they're in the process of reviewing right now.
What about okay? So why did you wait till people plateaued? Why not do a group control that just does physical therapy, a group that does nothing at all, a group that does physical therapy along with this neurostimulation?
Yep. Also a very good question, and it certainly has crossed everybody's mind. So when we were working with FDA early to design the trial, we were really struggling for how to come up with a placebo here. And because that's how drug trials are done, you sort of compare to a sugar pill, and it gives you the people don't know. In this case, since physical therapy is part of the component, you could imagine, and we still wanted to make sure that people had stopped responding to physical therapy. And so then the design issue would be, if you're going to be randomized to the group that continues to simply get physical therapy after you've demonstrated that it's not going to work, you're never going to get patients to agree to do that clinical trial for 14 weeks. And the other issue is blinding. So if you did only physical therapy, would the physical therapists who are performing the trial try as hard? Would the patients think that they're in that arm? Would they also work as hard as the other people? So there is a whole bunch of design flaws that come into place. And where we landed with FDA is that we would have a high-frequency pulse device and a low-frequency pulse device, so that the patients would be blinded and patients and evaluators would be blinded to the treatment, and that way we could get as honest a profile as we possibly could scientifically. So yes, that would have been very easy, and I think everybody, an ideal if we could actually design a trial that would allow us to get to that data, but medical devices usually involve some kind of an intervention, and it was impossible to design this trial this way.
So what happened in the trial? The people that they exhausted physical therapy, did they continue physical therapy and then include the neurostimulation, or they just did neurostimulation, no physical therapy after that?
So what happened was, let's say you and I were participating in the trial, and I would have completed my physical therapy, and I'd been deemed that I'm not getting any better. So then I would have had my balance evaluated, and I would still have a pretty profound balance disorder. In fact, on average, people that entered the trial had about a level of 40 on that particular scale that I talked to you about. So they were fairly disabled and a prognosis of a lifetime of that disability. So then I would have continued to do physical therapy and add neuromodulation. So add the PoNS to the physical therapy. And that's where we saw people within 2 weeks of treatment have about a 20-point change on this scale, when you would expect that there would be 0-point change because they'd already done physical therapy, and over a 14-week program have about a 30-point change. And then further, when discontinued all of the treatment, we measured 3 months later when you would expect that people would have drifted back, and on average people maintained their benefit for a further 3 months, suggesting that the brain had permanently changed. At least we know scientifically for 3 months. We're going to be gathering 6-month and 12-month data as we commercially treat people right now. So that's how the clinical trial went. So we were very encouraged by the results.
Okay, and have you identified additional mechanisms beyond the trigeminal nerve stimulation that you think would have a positive effect?
We are continuing the research. We are doing what's called PET scan work. So that's positive PET, positive emission.
Oh, positron emission tomography.
There you go. Yes. I apologize. It just slipped my mind. So yeah, we're doing PET studies to be able to see exactly when you stimulate the tongue, where does the stimulation go in the brain. That study is ongoing right now, but we were able to see some of the early images, and it does go into the motor cortex, so the part that mediates your movement, and so balance. And it also goes in the pleasure center of the brain, or the cingulate cortex, which also is consistent with what we've seen, that people find the sensation pleasurable. So we're just at the cutting edge of starting to learn these mechanisms to see what other potential applications for this technology is. But for now, we have done the testing in traumatic brain injury, and we'd like to pursue other clinical science to see if we might help people with other neurological conditions as we continue to figure out how this actually works.
Yeah, if you think about the diving experience, I wonder if you did things like put earphones on people to reduce or eliminate extraneous sound. I don't know, maybe do it in like a float tank, or just try to emulate the diving experience and see if there's more to that versus just the trigeminal nerve stimulation.
No, that work, believe it or not, was done by the U.S. Army. It was done back in the 2000s, and in fact, it was a precursor to this technology. Interestingly, just a couple minutes for the story. So the DARPA, the Special Forces research team, had a problem with Navy SEALs in that if you swim in a sleep-deprived environment, you tend to go around in circles because you have a dominant side. And so if your task is to go and scuba dive in the dark of night and put a bomb under a boat, it's really tough to do without doing that. So essentially, the same scientists that developed this developed what they called a tongue display unit, because the tongue is spatially aware, and they basically said if we stimulate right, go right; if we stimulate left, go left, and front and back of the tongue, forwards or up or down. And they tested the system in exactly that way in these large tanks that were devoid of light, and the tanks were at 98 degrees, so there was virtually no sensory inputs from everybody else. And after 3 hours, the people that were the control group that didn't have the stimulator in their mouth got out, and they, like any normal person being subjected to that, had to sit down a little bit for a minute or two and get their balance back and their bearings back. And the people that had the stimulator walked out perfectly fine. And that was one of the genesis of the idea that this neuromodulation through the tongue seems to help people preserve balance when they were doing these exercises. And so the idea was, I wonder if this technology might help restore balance in people who have lost it. And that's where the studies began back in the late naught years to determine this, and that's what ultimately yielded where we are today. So interesting that you mentioned that.
Great. Well, it sounds silly, but I was trying my own experiment while we're doing this interview. I was biting my tongue and putting something cold against it to see if I felt anything, just to be, why not? Maybe that's where all the good ideas came from. I don't know.
So just so you know, the trigeminal nerve can only be stimulated electrically through the tongue. If you were going to stimulate the trigeminal nerve through a cold compress, you actually have to do it on your temples, because that's where the branch of the trigeminal nerve is at a proximity to your skin that would actually yield that. So that's what happens in the diving reflex. It's the cold that hits the forehead of the mammal, and that seems to cause the same issue. And just physiologically, what happens is your the blood flow to the periphery of your body stops, and your vital organs are primed. So blood goes to your heart, to your head, to your kidneys, and your spleen just pumps more blood to that area. So it's a little bit of the fight or flight kind of system also. So it's all really interesting science that we're continuing to pursue on a parallel path, like I said. So we get to learn how this really works.
Okay, and then last question or two: how can people with a problem, traumatic brain injury, and inability to walk and navigate properly, get access to this? Do they need a prescription? Is it available widely, or is it just a few spots?
Sure. So in the U.S., it's still an experimental device. It's not been cleared by FDA. In Canada, it was cleared back in October of last year, and so there are a few clinics in Canada. I know that's not practical for Americans. Many people with traumatic brain injury and have a balance issue actually can't travel or struggle with traveling. So we're hopeful here that FDA. We submitted to FDA in late August, and back in January, FDA asked us some additional questions, which we've now responded. So the ball is back in their court, and we're hoping to hear from them soon on whether they are going to clear the device here. Once that's done, people will be able to go to large neuro rehabilitation clinics that we're in the process of building relationships with, so that they can essentially buy the treatment program to be treated for the disorder. So that's ultimately how this is going to be deployed. But as I said, in the U.S., we're not cleared yet. So unfortunately, it's not available in the U.S. yet.
All right. Well, very good. So what's the best way for folks to get in contact, ask questions, suggest collaboration, et cetera?
Oh, certainly. They can go to our website at heliusmedical.com, and there is a question and forum area there that they could drop questions off. Also, very happy to give people my email address if they want to go. So it's p.Deschamps, Deschamps, so DESCHAMPS @heliusmedical.com. And happy to receive emails with questions, and we try to answer all the questions that come through. And as I said, we're looking forward to make this available in the U.S. As soon as we finish our discussions with FDA.
That's great. Well, Phil, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Richard. All the best to you. Bye now.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.